Hello, I'm Charles Kovess, Australasia's passion provocateur. Welcome to this week's episode of the Charles Kovess Show, whether you're watching on Rumble or YouTube or listening via one of the many podcast platforms. I'll discuss some key issues and then let you know how the self-awareness and passion quest can help you in dealing with your response to these important issues. The show notes give you links to the foundational principles of this show and also details about my background. They also give you links to our websites, charleskovess.com and kovess.com, where you can find details of the Self-Awareness and Passion Quest, an executive coaching program, and many resources and details of books and all sorts of other useful information. So let's go with today's big issue. And it's really one big issue about the C19 issue, and you know why I call it the C19 issue. This week, the Australian government released the results of its inquiry into its behaviours over the last 4.5 years in dealing with a alleged medical problem. It was not a royal commission. Australia needs a royal commission. Every country needs the equivalent of a royal commission. A royal commission puts enormous powers into the hands of the commissioner appointed by the government to get to the truth of a particular issue. An inquiry is very limited in what it can do. And this particular inquiry that was run by the federal government was in fact told, don't assess the behaviours of the state governments led by the various state premiers. Of course, many of the actions that were taken over the last 4 years were taken by the states and not by the federal government. Nevertheless, the inquiry did look at the behaviour of the state governments and expressed many negative views about those behaviours as well as that of the federal government. Australia's actions in dealing with this virus are very similar to that taken by many other countries. In fact, so similar that it's clear that there was collusion amongst governments about what to do. My key point for you to consider is that this inquiry shows an incredible litany of bad and unlawful actions by governments, by politicians, by senior public servants, by all sorts of consultants retained by those governments in its response to this virus issue. It is a horrific litany, and I say that those who behaved in the ways articulated in the inquiry, and bear in mind that this is almost like a whitewash inquiry, and still it was an incredible litany. If it was a royal commission, it would be far worse, but these people must be held to account. I demand accountability. Human rights in Australia and around the world have been trashed by governments, all in the nonsensical name of safety, of protecting us. The Nuremberg Code, implemented after World War II and the horrific behaviour of Nazi Germany, was trashed. The Nuremberg Code was supposed to protect us. No, it was ignored. Mandatory medical intervention was imposed. Coercion was imposed on people to take poisons into their body. Mistakes were not made. The inquiry says mistakes were made. No, they weren't. They were deliberate. It's like a big brother like I was to my little brother. When I smacked my little brother and I got into trouble for it, or my parents said, what did you do? I said, I made a mistake. That wasn't a mistake. You know, in one sense, it was a pathetic argument to say that it was a mistake. I deliberately hit him, and I said to my parents, oh, no, that was a mistake. Bull. What happened by the governments, what I did to my younger brother is the same thing. Deliberate actions were taken. There were not mistakes made. It was a deliberate strategy by the Australian government, by many other governments around the world. How do I know this to be the case? I'll tell you why. As a lawyer, experts who had contrary views to the government or the experts retained by government were ignored, were silenced, and indeed were punished and cancelled, and doctors lost their practicing certificates for daring to question the questionable propositions of governments. Now just contemplate what that means. That's literally the same as a judge sitting on a trial. The government puts its case and says, we need lockdowns. We need people to be injected. And the opposition, namely us, the people, we say we're the defendants to this claim by government, and the judge hears the government's proposition and says, no, I've heard enough. I don't need to hear the counter argument to this. I think the government's right. I'm going to rule that the government, what it wants to do is correct. That is so objectionable. That is so contrary to natural justice. It would make your blood boil as it makes my blood boil. That's what happened. Can you imagine, any serious issue where a scientific principle is put to you and experts who have contrary views are silenced? By the way, that's also what's happening in the alleged climate emergency. Anybody who wants to prove there's no climate emergency is silenced. So it's happening again. There is no climate emergency. We've got a waste emergency, but not a climate emergency. That's what happened here. Mistakes were not made. Deliberate, bad and unlawful actions were taken by government pursuant to some other agenda. I've talked about that other agenda. It's an evil agenda that relates to a desire to create a one world government. And that's related to the behavior of the World Health Organization that I call the World Holocaust Organization, the WHO. The WHO wants to change the international health regulations and to have a new pandemic treaty that gives it these types of powers that governments imposed on Australians and people all around the world. There is no basis for such powers. And indeed, many experts that I deal with say that it's not possible to have a pandemic. Why? Because a virus will not kill its host. A pandemic would result in viruses ceasing to have hosts in which to thrive. The science on this is really quite clear. Pandemics don't happen. The only reason why it's called a pandemic is they changed the definition of pandemic. So the WHO wants to have global powers to make a declaration and countries lose their sovereignty. That's what's behind what we have gone through. And the inquiry showed that governments ignored all the previous learnings and suddenly responded in this particular way because what we were facing was so deadly. Lies, lies, lies upon lies. The inquiry then says that trust in governments has been reduced because you cannot trust governments that refuse to hear two sides of an argument. And I say this is good. I say to you, do not trust governments, do not trust politicians, because in earlier episodes of this show, and this is episode 216, I've talked about this quite a few times, the government does not care about you. The government is not here for your best interests. The government is run by politicians and bureaucrats whose key intent for most of them is their own comfortable lifestyles. And I want all of you to understand that, to stop assuming that government intends to do good for you. No, it doesn't. It wants to do good for the politicians. It wants to do good for the bureaucrats. The bureaucrats tell politicians what to do to make sure that bureaucrats get ever more power and ever more money and never lose their jobs. That's what motivates them. So do not trust government. And what that means is that each one of us has to question everything that government does. We have to question the basis on which they're making these decisions. And we as citizens, we have to shine a light on decisions and actions taken by government that are wrong, that are bad, that are unlawful. So where that leads to in the context of your own life is, okay, what do I do about this? Well, I say we need to demand accountability. The miscreants who took these steps that were not mistakes, but that were deliberately designed with some other intent, and I've told you what that is, leading to one world government, they must be held to account. And government officials and politicians who even leave government, we must hold them to account for the rest of their lives, because what's been imposed on us is as bad as anything that's been imposed on us. It is, by the way, I've been saying this for 4.5 years. For those of you who have been following me, I started saying this in March of 2020. I started losing friends who said, me talking about how fraudulent this action of governments is bad. We're putting people's lives in danger. I was willing to lose those friends because those friends were ignorant and those friends had no idea of what was going on. And those friends, in many cases, simply made this decision to believe that what government says is correct. Well, I urge you, do not believe what government says. And so we need to demand accountability. We need to hold these people to account. And that's why I've got this initiative called Track Dick Dan. Track dictator Dan Andrews, the former Premier of Victoria, so that man who made such a harmful impact on the state that I live in, for the rest of his life, we hold him to account. We must stop honouring these politicians who have done this harm to us. And I note again that in Australia, there are 6 premiers who were in charge while all this response was going on. They have all gone, and they're all being paid retirement funds. I wouldn't pay them a cent for the rest of their days for the damage they've caused to the states. Accountability. I demand accountability. So where this ties into your own self-awareness and your own passion is how important is truth and justice and freedom in your life. Think about that. Are you willing to give that away for comfort? Are you willing to forget about truth, to forget about justice, and accountability is where the justice comes in, and give away your freedom because government says, we'll look after you, we'll do the right thing, you'll be nice and comfortable, don't do anything to upset the apple cart, just comply with our rules. And this ties then into this misinformation and disinformation bill that's proposed in Australia and the attacks on free speech in Australia and around the world. And I don't speak up against us, and they're trying to make it illegal in Australia to speak up against what governments and politicians say, but they're not covered by the provisions of this ridiculous attack on free speech contained in this MAD bill. And MAD is a great acronym for this bill. I say each one of us has to speak up. We have to write letters. We have to talk to our communities. We have to say how appalled we are at the behaviour of politicians, of governments, of public servants, of bureaucrats. The future of humanity relies on us today because our freedoms have been attacked, they are being chipped away. And my question to you is, do you want your grandchildren to live in a totalitarian state? That's my question. Why I do what I do is because I've got 4 grandchildren. I don't want them to live in a totalitarian, dictatorial, freedom restricted lifestyle. We, each one of us, are responsible in the countries in which we live to make sure that these miscreants are held to account. It's our responsibility. We're not accountable for this, all right? If you don't do anything, no one's going to hold you to account except for your family. And I look upon my family holding me to account in future generations to say that I didn't do anything, that Julie didn't do anything. Yes, we are doing something. And I urge you to think about in terms of your own life, How important are these issues to you? One other matter I point out is that in the response of governments to this alleged terror, children's lives were sacrificed in the name of protecting the elderly. And I'm still appalled that the elderly didn't say anything, didn't stand up. The organizations of elderly, and there are many of them in various countries, they didn't stand up and say, no, we don't need protection at the expense of our grandchildren. That's what happened. I'm still in a state of being appalled, and that's why I do this show. That's why I hope to inspire you and excite you about the fact that 20 to 30% of Australians and people around the world understand what I'm talking about. And if we take action, if we refuse to comply with what these governments say, we can make a difference. Do you want to make a difference? I do. I'm responsible for the future of Australia. I'm responsible for the future of the world. I'm responsible for the future of humanity. Think about it. So, I hope today's show makes a beneficial difference to your life. A life that I believe is meant to be all that you are capable of making of it. If you're new to the show, check out the show notes for the foundational principles of this show and details about my background. And also check out our websites for links to my books and also lots of resources. That's covest.com and charlescovest.com. Again, thanks for watching and listening. And until our next show, may your week be full of health-giving and energy-giving passion, learning, fun, fulfillment, and a willingness to embrace the challenges that life gives us that helps us to increase our self-awareness. Because if you are comfortable, your self-awareness will not increase. But embracing challenge is how we learn about ourselves. Have a great week. See you next week. Bye.